Hello everyone, my name is Anupama Gowda. I recently graduated with a doctoral degree at the University of Texas at Dallas in Arts, Technology and Emerging Communications program. My research sits at the intersection of science and technology studies, embodied computing, and speculative design. Today I want to share a paper that comes from the final chapter of my dissertation, a chapter that turns away from analysis and toward encounter. The paper is called Sensing Prāṇa, Breath as a Trace, a speculative encounter with sensing. I want to begin with a question, not as a rhetorical gesture, but as the actual question that got me here. What becomes visible and when breath is sensed without being resolved? That question will stay with us for the next 20 minutes. Let me briefly orient you to what we will cover. We'll move through 6 sections. First, the problem, how contemporary wearables translate breath into data and what is at stake in that translation. Second, the historical and theoretical foundations of the research. 4, the epistemic turns in how breath has been known. Third, the infrastructure of algorithmic breath, what sensing systems actually do and what they quietly embed. Fourth, an 8-month-long embodied self-practice study I conducted with 2 wearable devices and the 3 kinds of frictions that emerged. Fifth, the main event, the Sensing Prāṇa installation itself, its design, its theoretical frame, its artifacts, and what happened when participants encountered it. And sixth, the core argument and its implications for research, design, and industry. This paper is part of a broader dissertation, so somewhat of the sense that I covered today is necessarily compressed, but I hope it gives you a sense of both the depth of the inquiry and the design sensibility it produced. Consumer wearables have moved from novelty to a core part of medical infrastructure. Smartwatches, smart rings, continuous glucose monitors, these devices now populate everyday life, and their presence in clinical and wellness context is growing rapidly. Among the many physiological signals enrolled in these systems, breath holds a particular place. Respiration is intimate. It is always happening. It is connected to emotion, attention, effort, rest. And yet, because actually sensing breath directly is technically difficult in a small wearable, these devices largely infer breathing through proxies. Heart rate variability, micro movements detected by accelerometers, photoplethysmography signals, all of this. But what this means in practice is that the breath you experience in your body has to travel through a long chain of translations before it appears on your screen. Air moves through your lungs. A sensor detects motion or pressure. A signal is filtered, cleaned, smoothed. An algorithm compares it against a population baseline. A dashboard converts it into a score. And finally, a notification arrives telling you what to do next. Each step seems reasonable on its own. Together, they amount to a substantial reworking of what is allowed to count as breathing. And that reworking is not neutral. The categories precede sensation: calm, stressed, anomalous, recovered. These appear as technical outputs, but they embed assumptions about what a good breath looks like. Assumptions about regularity, productivity, emotional steadiness, and risk. They reside in smoothing algorithms and default thresholds, and they shape interpretation even when they remain entirely unspoken. My central question is, what happens to breath in this translation? And is there a way to sense the body without immediately prescribing what that sensing means? To answer that, I need to locate where this moment comes from historically. My dissertation traces breadth across what I call 4 epistemic turns. The first is the ancient and philosophical. In yogic philosophy, breath is understood as prana, a vital force that animates and sustains life and living bodies. It is not reducible to airflow. It connects awareness, body, and environment. In phenomenological traditions, Ponty and Heidegger position breath as a rhythm of entanglement, not an object of surveillance. Across cultures, pneuma in ancient Greece, ki in Chinese medicine, ki in Japanese tradition, breath appears as a relational living force. The second turn is enlightenment science. Here, breath becomes a measurable metric. Spirometry is invented, calibration standards are established, laboratory practices are formalized, and as historian 𝗔𝗯𝘀 has shown in her work on spirometry, measurement devices did more than simply disclose respiratory truth. They embedded norms, ranked vitality, stabilized hierarchies, and naturalized differences under the language of objectivity. Racialized baselines, once inscribed in instruments, become infrastructure. The third turn is clinical medicine, where breath becomes a diagnostic variable. Authority migrates from patient to practitioner to protocol. Standardized reference values override individual lived accounts. Expertise becomes institutionalized. And the fourth turn, where we are now, is computational. Breath becomes data. Sensors, algorithms, dashboards, and notification prompts translate respiration into streams of interpretable signals. This is the moment this paper examines. What is striking when you hold these four turns side by side is how much has been left behind in each translation. Prana becomes measurable breath. Measurable breath becomes a clinical variable. A clinical variable becomes a data stream. At each step, something that was relational and contextual gets converted into something discrete and comparable. The question this dissertation pursues is what gets lost, and can design help us notice it? My dissertation moves into the infrastructures of contemporary respiratory sensing in detail. Wearable devices face a genuine engineering problem. Capturing respiration accurately while the device is on a moving body, subject to sweat, shifting fabric, and variable skin contact is technically hard. Fidelity signals legitimacy. All of these are in challenge. And so significant research energy goes into improving signal quality. But the chapter argues that problem is not only technical. Even perfect sensors would operate within classificatory systems that precondition interpretation. Calm, stressed, recovered, anomalous. These categories are not derived neutrally from data. They are constructed through population baselines, institutional demands, and design decisions about what counts as a good breath. Drawing on critical data scholars, be it Lupton on self-tracking cultures, Frank Pass on algorithmic opacity, Kate Crawford on AI's material infrastructures, and Boker and Starr on classification as world making, I argue that wearable platforms do not simply monitor breathing. They reorganize how bodily experience becomes knowable. They cultivate comparison, structure improvement, and reframe fluctuation as data-driven personal responsibility. Media theorists like Gillespie and Edward Finn go further. Algorithmic infrastructures do not only represent physiology, they modulate it. A respiratory fluctuation triggers an alert. The alert reframes sensation. The reframe may alter the next breath, and representation shades into intervention. What can be sensed gradually becomes what should be improved. This part is where I move into the infrastructures of contemporary respiratory sensing in detail, where wearable devices face all of this continually and hence move to further more challenges. This is where my work shifts from infrastructure to encounter. It reports an 8-month embodied self practice study conducted from May through December 2025, during which I wore both the Apple Watch and the Ultra Human Ring simultaneously, incorporating them into my daily life. The methodological framing draws on feminist STS. That's where I draw from Donna Haraway's situated knowledge and Neff and Knopf's work on self tracking. Rather than treating the wearer as a neutral research subject, embodied position is treated as a site of accountable inquiry. What emerged across these 8 months were three kinds of friction that I witnessed. The first is the temporal friction. When the data time interrupts lived time, lived breathing unfolds unevenly. It includes the heaviness upon waking, the agitation before a difficult conversation, the spaciousness cultivated in pranayama. Wearable systems depend on discrete intervals and continuous sampling. A high recovery score coincides with energy depletion. Two devices produce incompatible narratives of the same night. When sensation hesitates, numbers speak first. The second is the epistemic friction. When proxy measures stand in for breath, HRV, SpO2, and accelerometry stand in for respiration itself. These proxies gain credibility through formatting and repetition. What Wendy Chun calls the habituation of networked systems, rather than through faithful correspondence with lived experience. Quantifiable indicators are foregrounded while felt experience, improvisation, and slow adjustment remain peripheral. The third is the ontological friction, when data realities and lived realities diverge from one another. Be it the tantric and yogic traditions treat sleep not as a recovery but as a state within a larger continuum of awareness, invisible to sleep stage classifiers. Wearable breath technologies participate in defining what the body is allowed to be. They generate realities that coexist with and sometimes compete against embodied experience. Here, friction does not disappear with better calibration or more granular sensors. It persists, and it only is not the design problem as one would call it. It is an ethical one. This brings me to the conceptual part of my work, at the heart of this paper, which is all to do with the installation that I built. And this is where I turn towards prana rather than breath, and the shift is very, very deliberate. In many translations, prana is rendered simply as breath, but in yogic philosophy, it refers more precisely to a vital force that animates and sustains living bodies. It does not map neatly onto respiration. It cannot be reduced to airflow, oxygen exchange, or measurable pressure gradients. Prana names something relational, how breath is directed, restrained, cultivated, sometimes scattered across posture, attention, mood, and also the environment. B.K.S. Iyengar, the yoga guru, insists that awareness of prana does not arise automatically from the act of breathing. It requires discipline. Attention must be trained, often against ingrained habits of distraction. In the context of sensing technologies, this work becomes consequential. Contemporary systems translate respiration into physiological signals. Prana, by contrast, foregrounds breath as lived practice. as something shaped through intention and repetition. Naming prana explicitly interrupts the assumption that breath matters primarily insofar as it can be captured, averaged, and classified. It repositions breath as a dynamic force, keeping open a space where registration does not immediately become a decree. Prana is not proposed as a metaphysical alternative to physiology. It functions as an interpretive horizon, a way of remaining with breath as relational and situated, without prematurely stabilizing its meaning. The Sensing Prāṇa installation was exhibited at the ISED 2025 International Conference on Engineering Design, hosted at the Eric Johnson School of Engineering here at UT Dallas. The setting was not incidental. The ISED Marketplace South Corridor is a space where prototypes compete through scale, precision, and demonstrable performance. Posters clarify claims, prototypes foreground function, graphics are high contrast. The atmosphere leaned toward optimization, as if value could be secured through refinement alone. Against this backdrop, Sensing Prāṇa was deliberately restrained. A series of soft blue screens, patterned with repeating white pinwheel motifs, framed the encounter and established a visual field that read as serene and rhythmic. The pinwheels echoed doves in flight, introducing a symbolic ambiguity that referenced breath, motion, and air without collapsing into representation. The backdrop was positioned directly against a wall of glass, where natural light filtered through the blue screens and tinted the space with a calm luminosity while the lush green landscape beyond remained visible. The encounter unfolded at a threshold between inside and outside, control and openness, competition and environment. Several participants slowed their pace upon walking past the space. A few lowered their voices. That shift, however, slight indicated that composition can recalibrate expectation before any interaction begins. The interaction itself began with something almost embarrassingly simple: blowing into a pinwheel. Not a medical mouthpiece, not a sleek biometric interface, the kind of small toy you might find in a child's hand at a park. Participants were invited to blow into it. The gesture was ordinary, even playful, and that familiarity was deliberate. It lowered the stakes, it positioned breath as a bodily action before it became a signal. When someone exhaled, the blades spun. That movement activated a sensor tucked discreetly inside the setup, which registered the CO2 concentration in the exhaled breath. A value was computed, but what happened next did not resemble the continuous real-time feedback of a smart device. There was a pause. Participants waited. Some speculated about what their number would be. Others shrugged, suddenly unsure what the number would mean anyway. In a culture accustomed to instant biometric feedback, even a 1-minute delay felt stretched. That small interval shifted the texture of the encounter. Sensing was allowed to register without immediately asserting meaning. What they received was a breath print, a narrow thermal receipt, slightly curled at the edges, familiar format, the receipt that marks completion. Except this one refused to complete. It displayed a CO2 value alongside 3 lines of text. This is not a diagnosis. Your breath is not a number. This printout is a reflection, not a judgment. Some found this paradoxical. Why present a number and then deny its status? The disclaimers do not undo the computation. They narrow its reach. They ask the participant to treat the printout as a prompt rather than a finding. The breath print could be folded, pocketed, left on a table. It did not demand preservation. Its meaning depended entirely on what the holder brought to it, including skepticism. The theoretical vocabulary anchoring this installation I draw from 3 interrelated frameworks. First, I begin with Derrida's concept of the trace. The trace does not follow presence. It makes presence possible while also unsettling it. Through difference, meaning is always deferred, never fully coinciding with what it appears to name. The breath print functions as a trace in this sense, a mark of absence within presence, a registration that lingers without resolving into a final verdict. I follow through Chund's work account of habit and repetition. Stability in networked systems comes not from accurate recording but from repetition. Notifications become trustworthy because they appear tomorrow and the next day. Authority accrues through use. The breath print disrupts this habituation by refusing to repeat as instruction. It hands you a receipt that cannot be confirmed, queried, or acted upon. The third I follow through Galloway's theory of protocol. Control as distributed systems is embedded in standards and formats, not in central command. Breath data gains practical force not because it faithfully represents your experience, but because it fits a format that systems can receive and process. The breath print tries to register without fitting that format entirely. It participates in sensing while declining to circulate as actionable data. These frameworks help me ask, can a mark remain provisional? Can sensing linger at the edge of legibility without hardening into authority? I want to emphasize that these effects did not come about by accident. Every element of the installation was a compositional decision. First, the gesture. Exhaling into a pinwheel rather than a clinical device allowed me to position breath as ordinary action before it became a signal. Second, the delay. The waiting period before the receipt printed. It decoupled sensing from instantaneous interpretation. It created a thin layer of uncertainty that redirected attention from monitoring to reflection. Then the disclaimer in all my posters and all communication material. The language on the breath print explicitly refused clinical authority, narrowing the computational output to something more like a prompt. And the language of prana, phrases like quiet breath, prana is taking a break. Energetic breath, prana makes its presence known, were intentionally playful, not a mood measurement, a texture, an invitation to resonate, question, or dismiss. No correct interpretation was prescribed. The spatial context. The restraint of soft colors and slow pace operated as an embedded critique within an environment structured entirely around evaluation. The installation carved out a small interval of attentiveness without announcing itself as resistance. Each element did not mean much on its own. Their force lay in how they leaned on one another, composing conditions under which sensing could be felt without being immediately converted into evaluation. Nothing dramatic announced itself during the interactions. No revelations, no visible shifts in posture or expression that I could confidently name as impact. What emerged did so later in subtle ways, through repetition, through offhand comments, through questions that came hours or days after the encounter. A close friend returned to the installation multiple times. She blew into the pinwheel again and again, watching the screen respond, waiting for the receipt to print, reading each breath print carefully. She was not trying to improve a score. She seemed curious about the strange externalization of something intimate. Days later, she reflected. She said, "Part of me expected the printout to offer reassurance. When it didn't, I felt an unsettled curiosity. Why had I wanted the receipt to tell me something meaningful? An European attendee who introduced herself as a yoga teacher approached slowly, almost ceremonially. She paid less attention to the monitor and more to the sensation of exhalation, the subtle shift in her chest and diaphragm. She described the experience as a translation of inward practice into an unfamiliar register, not a competitor to yogic breathing, just a reframing. What did not emerge was consensus. Participants did not share a narrative about what their breath meant because the artifact refused to tell them. What did happen, however, was a kind of a meta awareness. Participants became conscious of their own expectation that sensing should deliver something useful, actionable, something that ranks. When the expectation was suspended, the expectation itself became visible. The installation succeeded less as a message and more as an opening. What persisted was not clarity, but a lingering question. Let me now reinstate my argument clearly. For me, uncertainty is not a design failure, it is a generative space. And hence, all of the claims that I have made, be it the first, where datafication converts experience phenomena into data by rendering them discrete, countable, and comparable, breath is continuous, cyclical, and relational. Its ontological complexity exceeds any data signal. This is not a technical limitation awaiting resolution, it is structural. Second, I say that the interpretive gap between data and meaning does not collapse with more granular sensors or multimodal inputs. It widens. The frictions identified in this research stems from breath's relational complexity, not from insufficient information. Third, design can compose conditions for attention and reflection rather than solutions or prescriptions. Sensing can remain perceptible as mediation, registered without displacing the breathing subject. Fourth, what I call institutionalized lore. The sedimentation of knowledge embedded in clinical protocols and consumer wearables treats breath primarily as a risk signal to be managed and not a relational process to be understood. Changing this requires not better metrics, but a different orientation toward what sensing is for. Let me close by drawing out implications for four communities. First, scholars, my fellow colleagues, I request all of us continue interrogating how breath shifts across systems, not as a stable object, but as something whose ontologies remain in motion. Fatigue, trust, and long-term engagement matter. So do the ordinary accommodations that unfold outside formal protocols of optimization. For designers, begin from the dynamics of the environment and the body, not from the computational abstraction. Treat design as an epistemic practice, one that produces new ways of knowing and encountering the body. Design with limits in mind. For industry, rethink wearables around interpretation, uncertainty, and lived experience, not only compliance and optimization. A wearable that earns the body's trust over time is more durable than one that earns its market position through feature count. For policy, move toward anticipatory governance. Hold meaning making accountable, not just data collection. Expanding wearable presence suggests the need for restraint. An ethics of humility would recognize that these systems participate in shaping how breathing is interpreted, evaluated, normalized, and governed. Having made these suggestions, I thank you all for patiently being with me through this presentation. I look forward to having a very, very engaged conversation with all of you. Thank you so much, IFM, for making this possible.